Hi friends, Kathryn Korostoff here, and today I'd like to have a conversation about data quality. When we talk about data quality in market research, it can apply to a lot of different things, and data quality is relevant whether we're doing qualitative research or quantitative research. But for the purpose of today's conversation, I'm going to be focusing on data quality essentials for survey research. Now, whether or not you're somebody who does your own data analysis or you work with a data analyst, it doesn't matter. Everybody who's doing market research, anybody who's doing survey research needs to know the basics of data quality. Obviously, when you're sharing your research results, you want to be confident that you're sharing data that can be relied on for making business decisions. Nobody wants to share data that might be of low quality. So let's talk a little bit about what that means for those of us who are producing professional quality market research. It means we need to make sure that we have the basics, some good foundations, so that when we are producing data, we are confident that it is reliable. And even if you're somebody who relies on somebody else to do your hands-on data analysis, you can still understand enough about data reliability so that you can make that assessment for yourself. Because the bottom line is that before you deliver a research report, especially when you're delivering a research report based on survey data, you need to be confident that you were able to optimize your survey research's data quality. Now, in reality, it can be challenging. And for those of you who may be newer to the survey research field, if you're new in market research, you may not be feeling very confident about your ability to optimize survey research data quality. And it's understandable. It is a complex topic, and there are many things that affect data quality. So in this conversation, we don't have time to go into all of the things we do to optimize data quality, but we are going to talk about a few of the key topics. But just for a broader context to get us started, there are many things that impact data quality. And again, even if you're working with a data analyst who's doing your data analysis for you, you can still know enough so that you can be informed and again, confident that you are sharing data that is going to be good enough for making really important business decisions. It really goes from the start of the survey research project all the way to the end. So when we talk about data quality and survey research, we do know that we want to make sure that we're starting off with good sample. That is, do we have a sample source that is going to give us people who are authentically representing our target market? So we need to make sure we have good sample sources and correct screening. And for those of you for whom this topic might be a new area to get into, we actually do have a course on sampling here at Research Rockstar that I'm biased, but I highly recommend. We also have to make sure we have enough sample. So you have to have good sample, but you also have to have enough sample. And that comes from decisions that are made during the planning process and creating a data analysis plan, and also being really clear about what your project objectives are, because depending on what the given project's objectives are, that's going to have implications for how much sample will be enough for data quality. We also have to make sure that we're getting quality responses from our wonderful survey participants. People are being kind and taking our surveys, but we have to make sure that we are getting quality responses from them. A lot of it has to do with, first of all, subject matter relevance. That is, are we asking people questions that are relevant to them? But a lot of this has to do with questionnaire design. Questionnaire design is a huge topic. We actually have two different courses on questionnaire design. We have a level 101 and a 201 course on questionnaire design here at Research Rockstar. And it really is a complex topic. A lot of people, especially people newer to survey research, don't realize that there's actually a lot of research on research that informs how we actually write questionnaires, how we structure them, how we make sure that the sequence is going to optimize the quality of the responses. Then there is a QA process. So after we've designed our questionnaire and collected our data, now we have to clean our data and we may need to weight our data. Finally, we have to make sure that we're doing the correct data analysis. Are we using the right statistical techniques, the right methods to make sure that we are getting the most accurate analysis and interpretation of the data? And this is driven, frankly, a lot by skills. Um, we need to make sure that whether we're supervising or collaborating with somebody else who's doing our data analysis or doing the data analysis ourselves, that whoever is doing the actual hands-on data analysis, creating the descriptives, creating crosstabs, creating multivariate data analyses, is qualified, that they know what they're doing, so that they avoid some of the common errors in actually creating the data analysis. Now, these are all big topics, but I recently had a conversation with one of our instructors here at Research Rockstar, Julie Worwa, who teaches our SPSS courses. And Julie was wonderful. We ended up having a sort of an impromptu conversation about data quality. And while we didn't get into all of those topics, we did touch on 4 of them. And I think that this is a good introduction, especially for those of you who may be feeling a little bit not very confident in your ability to optimize your survey research projects in terms of data quality. So please enjoy this conversation that I had recently with instructor Julie, where we did talk about outliers and weighting, understanding variability, and determining sample size needs. I think you'll find the conversation really helpful, and it's not too geeky, I promise. So please enjoy this conversation, and if you have any questions, do let me know. Hey everybody, Kathryn Korostoff here with instructor Julie Worwa. And Julie and I were just chatting about an important topic that relates to the Introduction to SPSS course, our SPSS 101 course. And I know a lot of our students have debated whether or not that they should dive into SPSS or not. And I really encourage people to check out the course, even if you're not somebody who's going to be doing a lot of your own SPSS work. If you have access to an SPSS license, it's a great opportunity to delve more into data analysis so that you can really understand the survey data that you're working with. And Julie's an awesome instructor and is really great about making it easy for people to sort of take baby steps to get into SPSS. And one of the things that she teaches in the course, we're going to spend a couple minutes on right now, which is about looking at data reliability. Now, in survey research, those of us who do survey research, obviously we know data reliability is an issue, but it becomes especially a big issue for many of us these days because there's so much awareness amongst business executives, business decision makers, that there is bad data out there. We all see things in the news about bad survey data, other things that indicate bad data, or data being treated incorrectly. Julie, I'm sure you see examples of this as well.
Yes, I do. I just to give a pop culture example, I was watching the TV show The Dropout the other day, which covers the Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos story, and they had an interesting scene in which the company was deleting outliers in a way that was ended up being highly suspect for the company. And I had to laugh out loud when I was watching the show because that's something that we come across all the time in market research, and outliers affect reliability, and sometimes there are correct ways to handle outliers, and sometimes there are really incorrect ways. And they both affect reliability quite a bit, along with other things, which we'll cover in our little chat today.
I'm so glad that you have that example. I think that's such an interesting example. And I know you do talk about outliers in this class specifically. And, again, like you said, there are correct ways and incorrect ways. And it sounds like in their case that they were cherry picking what outliers they wanted to get rid of.
Exactly. They were picking the data points that did not support their hypotheses and the claims that they were making about the technology. And as researchers, we know that that is totally not kosher.
Yep.
So it's an apropos example of how not to handle your data and how to really mess with the reliability of your findings.
Awesome, awesome example. And again, for people who might be thinking about whether or not to take our SPSS 101 course, Julie does get into the treatment of outliers in the class. But another big topic related to data reliability, of course, is sample size. And this is a big topic for those of us in market research. And for those of you who may be newer to doing professional quality survey research, you might find yourself having some uncomfortable conversations with your clients or stakeholders who are coming to you for survey research about this topic. I know, for example, in my experience, in my career, I've had a lot of times where a client would come to me and they'd say, hey, Kathryn, can you help me with this survey project? I'd love for you to handle this for me. This is what I'm looking to do with this survey, and I'm thinking that we'll do a sample size of 1,000. It's like the client has this magic number in their head about what the sample size needs to be in order for their data to be reliable. Now, clearly, sample size is important. You do need to have a minimum sample size for data reliability. That is, if I want to be able to say that my survey data is reasonably representing a broader population of interest, of course my sample size is important. But there is no magic number. Although I will have one caveat here. There is something psychological about big numbers. And you may find yourself in a situation where, strictly based on math, that you would say, gosh, we really only need a sample size of, say, 500 to have reliable data in this case. And you might choose to do that sample size of 1,000 for kind of PR purposes, just because you might be delivering your research to a group that doesn't have a lot of knowledge about statistics, and you know that it's just going to be easier for them to believe the data if the data has a nice big number behind it. And it's unfortunate, but it is something that you may have to deal with. But there are a lot of cases where the sample size that somebody might ask you for is overkill and, frankly, is going to eat up a lot of budget. So what we want to make sure is, as professional researchers, that we know what's involved. Now, Julie, in your class, we do show this as one example of a formula for actually calculating sample size. And I know that we all, see that there's different online calculators and such. Why do you think it's important that we teach people to actually use a formula in this class?
Because it provides a really good rule of thumb. Uh, Clients often ask if they're looking for a rule of thumb in their data results. And so what they may want to say, I want to say with 95% confidence, my results are going to be within plus or minus X percentage points of, what we're reporting. And in order to be able to make that claim, you have to apply some sort of formula that takes those elements into account. And this particular formula does that really, really well. Just to walk through the elements of it, we've got 4 different elements. N is our sample size. That's the number we want to end up with. Z is typically 1.96 for a 95% confidence interval. So I'm just going to give you a little bit more introduction into this. Imagine a bell curve, a normal bell curve, where you've got the high point at the mean and then it goes down in nice slopes on either side. Standard rules of thumb in statistics will indicate that within plus or minus 1 standard deviation of that mean, you can be about 65% confident that your data is going to be fine. Moving that out to 1.96, that gives you the 2 standard deviations away from the mean for 95% confidence. So that's where that number comes from. It's not really a magic number that the market research gods came up with. It has to do with normal distribution of sample sizes and results. And typically in market research, we're looking at 95% confidence, or that plus or minus 1.96 standard deviations from the mean. We will also typically round that up to 2 for other statistical tests, but that's what that z-squared means. Okay, so the denominator in this equation is h squared, and that's the precision level required. Okay, that plus or minus 5 to 10 percentage points, plus or minus 2 percentage points, however however precise you want it to be. Okay, and then sigma squared is the standard deviation. Okay, and that's the standard deviation of your key metric question that you're using to derive, to plug into this formula. That can be something like overall satisfaction, or strength of relationship between the consumer and the brand. It can be, willingness to recommend, likelihood to repurchase. It's usually a key metric that's of significant importance to your client, and, something that they're really going to want to hang their hat on. So these four elements work together to come up with the sample size that you're going to need, that gives you the confidence level that you want, the precision that you want, and that's realistic for the data set that you're looking for.
I'm so glad that you walked us through the calculation, and this is a formula that I myself have used for many years. Of course, there are different formulas, just so folks know, this is just one example of a formula. There are different sample size formulas out there for different situations that you might be dealing with, but this is certainly a common one. And you'll notice here that we've got sigma is the standard deviation in red. And of course, standard deviation is a measure of variability, which we also have indicated in red in the text here. And the reason I want to emphasize that is because this is something that a lot of folks who are newer to survey research don't always appreciate, and it's so important. And it will also be important to you when you're explaining to your clients or stakeholders how you are, your basis for recommending what the sample size needs to be. And so let's talk a little bit more about variability, and I think it's really reflected well in the actual calculations. So when we actually, take a look at our formula again, and we say, okay, again, like Julie said, we're going to be doing, we want a 95% confidence interval. It's a very conventional goal. Some people might say, well, why not have a 99% confidence interval? And the reason why is because usually that creates a much larger sample size requirement. And is it really going to be that much more actionable? 95% is really a standard in all social sciences research. Whether you're doing consumer market research or other types of social research, 95% is really widely considered to be a convention of acceptable reliability. Is 99% more reliable? Absolutely, but it's going to make your sample size requirement so huge that it can become a budget issue. So 95% is excellent. So let's control our budgets, because for many of us, sample size does cost money. And so it may be unnecessary to incur the extra cost. So as Julie had mentioned, we've got our, numbers here that we're plugging in. We're plugging in 1.96 here for our 95% confidence interval. And in this case, we also have our estimate of the variability for this population. Julie,
Sure.
did you want to jump in there?
With the variability, this can come from prior research. Perhaps if you're doing a tracking study and in the last wave, for your key metric, the measure of variability or the standard deviation for that metric was 0.85, then you would plug that in. If you know that it was something else, you can plug in a different value too. But that really is the measure of the variability, because sample size is driven primarily by that variability. It's not a function of proportion of population or anything like that. It all has to do with how variable the data is. If you don't know the standard deviation, if you're just starting on a brand new study and you don't have a base of comparison, mathematically you can get reliable results by plugging in 0.5 for the most conservative estimate on your standard deviation. And with statistics, we do want to be conservative with this. So plugging in 0.5 will give you a very reliable measure of standard deviation for purposes of this calculation. Okay. Just to dovetail a little bit on what Kathryn was talking about with 95% confidence, I think she made some wonderful points for 95% confidence being the standard in social research. One of the things we need to remember as market researchers is that we are doing market research. We're talking about top two box and means. And, we're not finding cures for diseases or bringing astronauts back from the moon here. You know, we want people to buy more cereal, or buy another camera or things like that. And for stuff like that, 95% confidence is an extremely strong measure. And Kathryn's points about budget are particularly important, especially as a lever to persuade your client that maybe you don't need to go quite that high, because here's what it would do to the budget. And depending on your data collection method, more sample can be exponentially more expensive. So, just working through this particular formula, we end up with a sample size of 277. So, you could round that up to 300 just for the sake of round numbers. It makes it easier for your data collection partners to create their estimates. But, but you will know that as long as you've got 277 or more, you'll be able to say with 95% confidence that our data points are going to be within plus or minus 10 points of what we're reporting here. Okay, so that 95%, go ahead, Kathryn.
Excellent. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to jump in. Why don't you finish your thought, and then I'm going to add on
Okay,
one thing before we
that
wrap up.
95% confidence means that, it's not really a measure of, like, oh, well, I'm 95% confidence. What it means is that if we were to do this same test 100 times, 95 times out of that 100, we would get the exact same results. So that's what it means. It's not like, I'm giving it a 95 out of 100, for a rating. Statistically, it means if we were to run the test 100 times with 100 different samples, 95% of the time we would get the same results as we do in this one. That's why 95% is kind of a holy grail for social science research. That's a really high measure of reliability and confidence in the data.
Yeah, and that's a really, replicability is always the highest standard. So, you do it 100 times, at 95, you'd get the same results, plus or minus those 10 points. That's really telling you that you've got, good data. So replicability is always our highest standard. That's what we want. We want to make sure that we didn't just end up with data that was interesting but wouldn't be replicable. So I'm really glad that Julie talked about that. Now, in this case, this is a case where there's not a ton of variability. And I can tell you from my experience that different product categories and different populations of interest really do have low variability. If you do a lot of work in product categories that are fairly mature, for example, you tend not to see so much variability. Whereas if you're doing work in product categories that are newer, you will see more variability because customer attitudes and behaviors tend to be more diverse with newer product categories. You'll see that people have different levels of price sensitivity, or they might have more variability in terms of what product features are important to them. So in newer product categories, you'll typically see more variability in customer attitudes and behaviors. And in mature product categories, you'll see that it can be the opposite. Not always. I don't want to say that's a hard rule, but just in general, you will find that the variability, and again, when we say variability, what does that really mean? We're talking about human beings, and they have attitudes and behaviors, and we're measuring those attitudes and behaviors in a survey. The amount of variation in their attitudes and behaviors does tend to vary by product category. And so if you're tackling a product category that you haven't done before, a good exercise is to start by thinking at a very high level. So if I'm thinking about at a high level about a product category, is this a product category that is going to have more or less variability? And Julie and I both love this example of thinking about two different common consumer products, eggs and shampoo. Well, if you were doing research, let's imagine you're doing two surveys at the same time. You're doing one survey to understand customer attitudes about eggs, and you're doing another survey about customer attitudes about shampoo. And maybe those attitudes have to do with product features or brand preferences or usage behaviors, whatever. Which of these categories do you think is going to have greater variability? That is, Are customer attitudes and behaviors more diverse as relates to eggs or more diverse as relates to shampoo? Now, Julie, I know you've used this class example in class for a few years now. How do your students typically
It's
respond to
been a
this?
real interesting set of discussions. More often than not, students will indicate that the shampoo market is likely to be more variable. But there are some students that will say that the eggs market is likely to be more variable. And they'll give examples like organic versus non-organic, free-range chicken eggs, brown eggs, white eggs, different sizes of eggs, different brands, different methods of packaging the eggs, things like that. So it's surprising to me to think that there is really that much variability in the egg market when, as Kathryn said, it's really a very mature category. Some people would say eggs are eggs. But on the other hand, when you're thinking about shampoo, just imagine yourself going down the shampoo aisle at your grocery store or your drugstore. There are so many different varieties.
Oh my gosh, at my store,
Yeah.
it's crazy. It's crazy. I think in my local grocery store, I think they've got, it's like
Oh, yeah.
5 shelves, and the shelves have got to be at
Oh,
least
yeah.
10 feet
And,
wide.
floor to ceiling almost. And then, on either side in my store, I mean, they've got the men's on the one side and the ladies on the other, and all sorts of brands and fragrances and treatments for different hair conditions, dry hair, oily hair, curly hair, African American hair, color
Color
treated
treated.
hair, all this kind of stuff. And then,
Yeah.
we're getting into size and fragrances of containers and price. And, it's an
Mm.
incredibly variable market. So in the context of this is to illustrate that, the greater the likelihood that consumers are going to have a more diverse set of attitudes and behaviors about any particular product, the larger the sample size you are going to need to account for that variability and have reliability in your data. And, it's really interesting. Um, and it's definitely something to talk about with your research team and your client to see what their initial hypotheses are and see if the research will, refute or support them.
Yeah, it's really, again, we do like to use formulas, and hopefully you'll have access to past data so that you know what the standard deviation is likely to be. And even if you're, even a ballpark, even just, to get you in the right neighborhood, because then once you collect your data, of course, now you can actually now you're going to be able to calculate your actual standard deviation, which might be based on a key metric, or it might be,
Hmm.
across multiple metrics. But you're going to be able to look at your actual standard deviation and do that sanity check of, well, we were expecting a low variability, low standard deviation, to, indicating low variability, and guess what? That's what we found. Or hey, guess what? We actually got more variability than we were expecting. But if you have past research, you should be in the neighborhood. But it's always a good idea just to sanity check once your data is actually collected, and it's a very easy calculation to do if you're using SPSS, as Julie teaches here, or any of the other statistical programs. So just to wrap this up, I just want to point out that this is one of many important topics that Julie covers in our SPSS 101 course. She also does talk about outliers and how to manage outliers and data cleaning and weighting, in addition, of course, to teaching you the basics of SPSS. And something that I found really helpful to me in my career, especially early on, was getting into SPSS, because when you can touch your own data, when you can run some basic data on your own, even if you have a data analyst or a team that does most of your heavy lifting on your data analysis for you, the ability to be able to go in and do a quick sanity check or to run something really quickly is gives you a sort of an advantage in terms of being able to quickly clarify a data point or explore an idea. If you're totally dependent on other folks for your data analysis, you may not have quite that level of flexibility to do just a quick run on something. You know, I might say, gosh, this result was really interesting. Now I'd like to look at it a different way. I might want to, you know, either I want to filter that data point by a certain variable, or I might want to say, gosh, you know, I want to do a quick test to see whether or not there's this difference here is significant. But having that ability to do a little bit of my own SPSS really gave me an advantage early on in my career, because I could do things quickly on my own and explore things. Whereas if everything had to be a request to somebody else, either I wasn't going to get the result back fast enough, or frankly, I was reluctant. I would kind of filter my ideas of, well, I'm only going to ask for stuff if it's super duper important. If it's just sort of a preliminary idea that I just want to explore, I don't want to ask my data analyst to take their time to do that. So for me personally, I think that learning SPSS early in my career really did give me a
I
career
would echo
advantage.
that. Yeah,
Julie, I
I
want
would
to thank you
echo
so
that,
much. Oh,
Kathryn, that
please go
you
ahead.
know, being able to run these types of analysis gives a person, you know, so much more confidence, and that confidence translates into credibility with your clients, and that is a significant advantage as well. Kathryn?
Excellent. Yeah, so Julie, thanks so much for having this conversation with me today. And again, I hope to see our students joining in on SPSS 101. Julie teaches SPSS 101 and SPSS 201. And I really recommend, again, not only just for learning the SPSS itself, which is a great tool to learn, but also so that you can learn more about topics like calculating sample sizes, looking at data reliability, outliers and weighting, and data cleaning, and all the good stuff we have to do when we are doing professional quality survey research.